Here we are for week 2 of World Civilizations to 1500, and tonight our lectures will be lecture 3 and lecture 4 for tonight and on this videotape. Last week, let's see if we can get this on the screen. Yes, okay. Last week, you read the prologue to the human record, which was essentially asking you to look at primary sources and see how you can sort of ferret out the truth in them. And last week, we talked about primary sources and what they were, and we talked about the whole issue of what is history and what is truth. And I suggested to you that there are different kinds of sources in history. There are different levels of truth and explanation. If you look at your textbook, that's a book that has looked at a lot of secondary sources and pulled them all together. If you look at, say, a book, for example, on ancient Greece, the author would have looked at primary sources but is interpreting them. But the closest we can get to the truth is the primary sources, the sources written by the people themselves. And so tonight we don't have too many of them for either of our lecture topics, Egypt and Mesopotamia. So I'm going to try to spend as much time as I can with the primary sources and discuss how to use them with you. Okay, and I'll bring them up as I come to them. Also, on the website, there are lecture notes for every lecture. You can go on the website and download or print out the lecture notes before the lecture so you can have them before we start the class. There are some additional readings on the website. For this week, for example, I have the prologue and the epilogue to Hammurabi's Code, and those are both on the website. Next week, there'll be a number of primary sources on the website for you to print out. So we'll just start with that. Okay. So we're going to look at the Middle Eastern cradles of civilization, and the title of this lecture is Mesopotamia, the Search for Order, and it's essentially the area of modern Iraq, and they're still searching for order in modern Iraq today. So they come from very ancient roots of not having any order, and as we talk about the Middle East and the Mesopotamian River Valley, we'll see that it has a long history of being very chaotic, and the themes for this lecture are bringing order out of chaos. Okay. We mentioned last time the New York Times Cleopatra career woman, and I mentioned to you that this is a way that history changes, the truth in history changes, that it used to be thought that Cleopatra was more of a siren and a seductress, and now she's being interpreted as a career woman. There was an interesting article in the New York Times last January called Free Will, Now You Have It, Now You Don't. And this topic came up last time, and some of you were interested in the topic of free will. This article, I think you can go on the New York Times website and look it up, but basically it's by Dennis Overby, and he's discussing whether or not we have free will according to the new scientific evidence. And the more science looks at the functioning of the human brain and the human organism, the more scientists are coming to the conclusion that we in fact do not have free will. And this is a very ancient argument. It goes all the way back to St. Augustine. He actually quotes the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in this article, and he said, as Einstein paraphrased it, that a human can very well do what he wants, but cannot will what he wants. In other words, you may want a lot of things against your will. You may want things that are beyond, that's more determined, beyond your choices. And that argument goes back to St. Augustine. I mean, it's St. Augustine who first framed that argument during the Roman Empire. The conclusion of this is, well, to suggest a couple of things he talked about. Experiments with brain signals and actions as people attempted to do things or made up their minds to do things, their brains were monitored, and Dr. Liebert found that brain signals associated with these actions occurred half a second before the subject was conscious of deciding to make them. And then he goes on to argue from computer science that machines actually can be said to have free will in that they make certain decisions from the facts that they're given, and humans have that kind of free will and not very much after all. So the argument he's making is what scientists are now saying, that determination, that everything is determined, and a lot of the argument is genetic. So that's one of the arguments we'll be looking at as we go through this course. Another article from the New York Times, again, this is from February 2000. What we all spoke when the world was young, tracing human migration through languages. In the beginning, 50,000 years ago, more than 50,000 years ago, there was only one language, and that was in Africa in the ancient dawn of civilization. People began moving out of Africa, and as they moved out and went to different areas and isolated themselves in groups, they developed different languages. 50,000 years ago, Afro-Asiatic was developed, and from that came Dravidian, which is a language now spoken in southern India. 40,000 plus years ago, Austroasiatic was spoken, which is the language basically of Australia and New Guinea and those ancient islands of Melanesia. 40,000 years ago, Indo-European was developed in Europe. And 12,000 plus years ago, Altaic, Eskimo, and Amerindian was developed in the trek across Asia to the Americas. And I have a map that shows you that. I don't know how well you can see that. The writing is kind of small, and especially since I've cut some of it off. But you can see the different regions. The beginning was in Africa in the red 50,000 years ago, and then the arrows go out from Africa to the various places in Asia, Europe, and across the Siberian Strait to the Americas, and also from the north of India into the Pacific Islands. So you can see the root of these languages as traced by this article. Okay, compare that to the map I showed you last week of early human migration, and this is determined from genetic evidence. And so, again, it's quite interesting if we go back and forth between these two maps, how parallel they are. Linguistic evidence almost parallels what we see from the genetic evidence, so that the roots are the same as we go in these areas. So, as a result of this, we end up studying civilization, looking at civilization. What is civilization? How do you define civilization? And remember to use your microphones on your desk. How do you define civilization? Yeah.
By its people, by the people that inhabit a land.
Okay, well, but that would be defining a specific civilization. But how would you define the concept of civilization itself? What is civilization?
It's a political and an economic and social structure all together.
Okay, that would identify a particular civilization. Does anybody else have a definition of civilization? What would you call civilization? How would you define what it is? Yeah.
Is it a specific group of people who are unified through a certain culture, through a similar culture?
So people would be unified in a certain culture. What other characteristics are about civilization? Do we have any Latin students in here? What are the origins of the word civilization? Anybody know? Civitas, yes. Oh, you press your mic and tell us. Okay. Expand on that. Go ahead and press your mic and expand on that. You have to hold your finger on it. Yeah.
It comes from civitas, Latin word that means civilian or citizen, I guess is more accurate. It means that a person has a certain civic responsible to them, so they have jobs and so forth. that are organized by the state. So.
Okay, kiritas is a word that has something to do with citizen. Okay, right? What is a citizen? Let's go from that. What is a citizen? Yeah?
An inhabitant of a land.
Of a land?
Of a place or of a society.
What is the word civic? Have you heard the word civic? What does civic mean?
Organized?
No? What does civic mean? See, you all should study Latin if you want to know the meaning of these words. What does civic mean? Do your civic duty. You are a citizen of a city. You are a citizen of a city. Okay. Civilization was originally coined by the Romans, and it has to do with living in cities. And so the original definition of civilization was living in a city. Okay, so that this concept by the Romans has structured the way we study history ever since that time. We study world civilizations. Okay, so that defines what we're going to look at. We're going to look at cities, right? We're going to look at civilizations that have cities. And so the first civilization we're going to look at is Mesopotamia, and those were the first cities in the entire world. And so they are then defined as the first civilizations. Now, you may not agree with that definition of what is a civilization if you define a civilization as a culture or as a set of beliefs and customs for one place or one people, because you might want to say, well, not all civilizations are based on cities. And we're going to run into one of those today, a civilization that's not based on cities. But the original definition of the word was a city, living in a city. Okay. So a civilization is originally defined as city life. So that would make the Stone Age villages not civilizations. They would be cultures, they would be people living in groups, they might be living in one place and might stay there for a while, but basically moving around. And they're not, according to the original definition of civilizations, they're not really civilizations. Okay, so who decides who is civilized and who is not? In this case, it's the original Latin word and the original Roman definition of what a civilization is. A civilization is a city, people who live in cities, and Rome was the city, of course. So we kind of start off with that concept of what a civilization is. All right, so Mesopotamia was the first group of cities, and it's a city civilization that shares a common culture in the Mesopotamian River Valley. They practiced settled irrigation agriculture. That means they stayed in one place. And this is based on the particular technology, the technology of irrigation. Okay, because the Stone Age villages, they moved around because they practiced slash and burn agriculture. After they wore out the soil, they would pick up all their belongings and they would move to another place where there was fertile land because they had worn out the soil. And so this was not settled agriculture. We have settled agriculture beginning in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. The first irrigation technology was developed there so that people could stay in one place virtually forever. And this creates the condition for civilization. Yeah, question?
Wasn't the Harappa civilization in eastern India, was that not the first one to develop an irrigation system?
It is contemporary to Mesopotamia, the Harappa civilization. And we could study that if they had left any written records, but they didn't. And they didn't leave very many archaeological records either. So they existed, and we know little more than that about them. We don't even know what language they spoke. And I think they did have some kind of written symbols, but we can't translate it. Anyway, it's contemporary to Mesopotamia. Okay, some people think, as I told you last time, that the key to civilization is beer. That I think this is a joke. One of the earliest recipes that's ever been found is a recipe for beer found in Mesopotamia. And so some scientists were saying, archaeologists were saying, well, they founded civilization so they could have a steady supply of beer. But I kind of doubt that. Anyway, so let's look at the particular geography, because as we look at these early civilizations, geography is very key to how that civilization develops and what kind of culture it develops. Mesopotamia means between the two rivers. It's a Greek word, between the two rivers. And the two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. And we have the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. One of the rivers is very fast. I think it's the Tigris. Sometimes I get these mixed up. But one of the rivers is very fast, and the other river is very slow. So what you have is a two-way transportation up the Mesopotamian River Valley. So that you would take the slow one, you would go upstream to the top of the valley, and then you would take the fast river down to the delta, to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And so this creates a two-way transportation system. The rivers also spread the culture up the valley, because you can move up the valley. The original culture was at the delta of the rivers right on the seacoast, and the culture spreads up the valley. Okay, the geography is not very conducive to living. I mean, if you had to pick a paradise on earth, you would not pick Iraq or Mesopotamia. It's a treeless plain. It's a desert. It has terrible weather. It has violent storms, frequent floods, and frequent droughts. It's also surrounded by mountains on all sides except for the sea, and in those mountains there are uncivilized tribes that frequently attack the civilization, the city-states that they have. They form a lot of city-states. Why do you think the uncivilized tribes in the mountains would attack the city-states? Anybody guess why? I mean, are they just mean? Do they just like to kill people? Why? Yeah, why?
Maybe for their goods. Maybe like since you said they were an agriculture community, maybe for their food or for some of their, I guess, whatever domesticated animals they had.
Yes. Okay. They're living in cities, and they can accumulate wealth in cities. They can accumulate goods of all kinds in the city: animals, agricultural goods. Plus, they develop crafts like pottery and textiles and working of gold and silver. And so the cities are very wealthy. The uncivilized tribes in the mountains are still hunting and gathering, and so they're essentially uncivilized, and they don't have those goods. So the city becomes a target for people who are poor, who want the things that the city has. Okay, so here we see the Mesopotamian River Valley. Be familiar with this map, because this is the map you're going to have your test on. So here is Mesopotamia between the two rivers. It's the yellow portion here. And here we have a close-up. I'm sorry, the rivers aren't quite so clear because we have boundaries of various civilizations. But can you see the two rivers there as we go up? Oops. And you can see a close-up of the region that is modern Iraq. That's the area we're looking at. Okay, and here is the Tigris at Nineveh, one of the major cities of that area. We can see the Tigris River. Again, it's a treeless plain. It's surrounded by mountains, and it's a desert. It's subject to violent and severe weather. Here's the Euphrates and the plain of Chaldea again. And here is a photo that was sent to me by one of my former students. Her husband was in Iraq, and he sent her home these photographs, and she said, "Oh, I know what those are," because she had taken this class. So she sent them to me. But you can, there's a wonderful photograph, because you can see how desolate this land is and how barren it is. And so why do they pick it as a place to begin civilization? Because near the river they can irrigate, and they have a dependable source of water. But this is a very barren land. It's inhospitable. It's not a good place to live. Okay, Sumerian culture was the first, and it was set up in the delta of the rivers. The delta of the rivers is in the lowland in the valley, but the weather in the valley comes from the mountains, and thus they say the gods are in the mountains. Sumerian culture is the original culture. It is the core culture. It's the culture that set the pattern for all the rest of the Mesopotamian cultures. It's that core culture that spreads upriver. Okay. The gods of Mesopotamia define their problem of chaos. The Sumerians began the asking of religious questions, and they came up with religious answers. The first work in Western civilization, or in any world civilization period, is the Epic of Gilgamesh that was written about 3000 BC, the first work of literature. Let's pause for a moment and think about the region of Mesopotamia. I've described the weather for you, the frequent storms, frequent floods. To this day, there are terrible floods in Mesopotamia. In the early 1900s, something like 8,000 people died in one of these floods in Baghdad. There are violent storms and violent weather. The Sumerians based their gods on the weather. They identified the weather as the gods. It's unpredictable, it's violent, it's unexpected, and it's ferocious weather. So what do you think their gods are going to be like? Yeah.
Maybe angry or vengeful, spiteful, maybe.
Vengeful, angry, yes, violent gods, uncaring gods. What else?
Isn't there also a story when there's it's related to the Genesis episode, and the gods come down on there's a flood, and the gods come down on the bodies of the dead like flies, and they're very angry, and they just want to cultivate their own wealth, and they don't really care about the inhabitants.
Yes, there is a story, and we're going to talk about that story today in just a little while. But this is what the gods are like. They don't care about these people. They are violent, they are vengeful, they are murderous, they are destructive, and they don't care about human beings at all. And that's the kind of environment they live in. That's the geography and the weather that they live in. And they assume that this environment they live in is determined by the gods, the weather, the forces of weather, the wind, the rain, the storm. They're all gods. Okay. They live in a world that seems to them chaotic, and so the whole theme of their culture is to bring order out of this chaos. And those are the religious questions that they began asking. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation. And you don't have that. You have a whole bunch of creation epics in one of your readings books, but not that one. So I'm going to read a little bit from that one to you today in just a moment. Tiamat is an example of a Sumerian goddess, and Marduk is an example of a Sumerian god. Okay, I'll come to that in a minute. I want to look for a minute at the map of the delta. This is the delta where the river flows into the sea, and all of these yellow cities are the Sumerian cities that formed the core culture of the Sumerians. Okay, notice some of them. Uruk should be there somewhere. Larsa, Shirpura. I think Erech is Uruk. But these are the original Sumerian cities, and then the cities in purple are Akkadian cities. And again, these cities are all independent of each other. They're not unified into a state. Sumeria is not a country. It's not a unified state politically. Okay, each of these cities is completely independent of every other city, and they spend their whole lifetime fighting each other. They're competitive with each other. They're merchant cities. They trade and they compete. And so the history of this area is a history of competition and constant warfare between them all. It makes you think of the rock today, unfortunately, but this is what it was like in the very beginning. Okay, here's the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, where they flow together, where the first Sumerian cities were. And here is Ur of the Chaldees, one of these Sumerian cities. This is a 1900s engraving of the remains of it. Here are some of the Mesopotamian gods, which are gods of violence and uncaring of human beings at all. Okay. What are myths? What are myths? Myths are truths that are no longer believed. Okay. The Sumerians explain their gods through myths. They tell myths or stories about their universe, about things in the universe as they see the universe developing. Myths are the way that the ancients explained the universe. Their environment defines their religion. The gods are the forces of nature. And as we said, the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation, and it is full of gods and goddesses which represent forces of nature. And it begins with a great battle between the gods. And let me read a little bit of the Enuma Elish to you. I won't read too much of it. It's very long, actually. The Babylonian creation is what it's called. Actually, I might define this before I read it to you. It's the Babylonian creation because it's a Babylonian rewriting of the Sumerian creation, and you'll see that in a moment when I read it to you. You'll see the Sumerian remnants. The very first part is Sumerian. Okay. When there was no heaven, no earth, no height, no depth, no name, when Apsu was alone, and Apsu is the sweet water, the first begetter, okay, and Tiamat was with Apsu. Tiamat was the bitter water, and that returned to the womb, her mumu, when there were no gods, okay, when sweet and bitter mingled together, no reed was plaited, no rushes muddied the water. The gods were nameless, natureless, futureless. Then, from Apsu and Tiamat, in the waters, gods were created. In the waters, silt precipitated. Okay? Lamu and Lahamu were named. They were not yet old, not yet grown tall. When Anshar and Kishar overtook them both, the lines of sky and earth stretched where horizons meet to separate cloud from silt. Okay, they're naming the earth and the sky. Days on days, years on years passed, till Anu, the empty heaven, heir and supplanter, firstborn of his father in his own nature, begot Nudamant Ea. Okay, this is the god Ea, and you run across him in some of your reading. Ea. Ea is intellect, wisdom, wider than heaven's horizon, the strongest of all the kindred. Okay, now we have some gods begotten by the mingling of the sweet and bitter waters. Discord broke out among the gods, although they were brothers, warring and jarring in the belly of Tiamat. Okay, they were not yet born. All the gods were in the womb of Tiamat, the mother. She's the bitter water. Heaven shook. It reeled with the surge of the dance. Apsu could not silence the clamor. Apsu is the father god. Apsu could not silence the clamor. Their behavior was bad, overbearing, and proud. But still Tiamat lay inert till Apsu, the father of gods, bellowed for that servant who clouds his judgment, his mumu. Dear counselor, come with me to Tiamat. And then he comments on the children in her womb. Their manners revolt me. Day and night without remission we suffer. My will is to destroy them, all of their kind. We shall have peace at last, and we will sleep again. So, we don't even have the gods born or created yet, and the Father wants to destroy them all. Okay? When Tiamat heard, she was stunned. She writhed in lonely desolation. Her heart worked in secret passion. Tiamat said, "Why must we destroy the children that we made? If their ways are troublesome, let us wait a little while." Then Mumu, who is a kind of spirit, advised Apsu, and he spoke in malice. Father, destroy them in full rebellion. You will have quiet in the daytime, and at night you will sleep. Apsu heard this, and his face flamed with the pleasure of evil, but he embraced Mumu. The decision was known to all their children. Confusion seized them, and after a great silence, for they were confounded. The God who is the source of wisdom, the bright intelligence that perceives and plans, Ea saw through it. He sounded the coil of chaos, and against it devised the artifice of the universe. He spoke the word that charmed the waters. The waters slept, and Apsu slept. Then Ea ripped off his flaming glory coat and took his crown. He set himself the aureole of the king. When Ea had bound Apsu, he killed him, and the Mumu, the dark counselor, he led by the nose and locked away. Okay, so Ea, the goddess of wisdom, has now rebelled against the father, and the universe begins with patricide. He kills his father. Ea had defeated his enemies and trodden them down. Now that in his triumph, he rested in the holy place. Ea slept. He built his house and shrine, and there magnificently he lived with his wife Damkina. We don't know where she came from. This doesn't have to be logical, okay? It's not logical at all. All right, and then in that room, the point of decision, he was conceived Marduk. Ea begot him, and Damkina bore him, father and mother. And so Marduk, who is going to become the king of the gods, was born. He was beautiful. His stride was majestic. He was the leader from the first. Okay, Ea rejoiced. Okay. And they call him my son, son of the sun, and heaven's son. Then Anu begot winds and brought them from the four quarters to be the van and to command the ranks. And he brought the tornado, a wild surf, to worry Tiamat. Now Tiamat starts out as a tender mother who's guarding her children. Now she goes through an enormous change. She goes through a personality change, because we saw her at first, she was a kind and loving mother. Now she marries a new husband. This is Kingu, and Kingu is a farmer. He is an agriculturalist. And all the gods, her children, look down on him. They think he's inferior. And now in the epic, she goes through a transformation. She becomes an old hag, the first mother, and she mothers a new brood. And the new brood is the worm, the dragon, the female monster, the great lion, the mad dog, the man-scorpion, the howling storm, Kilulu, and Kusariku. Okay, and she defends Kingu. Her children by her first husband, Apsu, who's now dead, rebel against them. They hate Kingu, and now they hate their mother Tiamat, and so they go to war led by Marduk against Tiamat. And I'm skipping a whole bunch because we could just go on again, and it does go on. But Marduk leads all of his brothers and sisters and all the other gods in a battle against Tiamat, and in a great climactic battle, he kills Tiamat, and he chops up her body, and he makes the world out of Tiamat's body. Okay, the universe, the sky, the heavens, the rivers, the mountains, these are all parts of Tiamat's body. Okay, if I can get to that. Okay. Well, this is how the world is created. It's created in horrible violence, in murder, in fratricide and matricide. Then if you read through this, you can see the beginning of government, because all of the gods then set up a throne for Marduk, and he sat down facing his forefathers to receive the government. And so we see the beginning of government in the epic. We have called you here to receive a scepter to make you king of the whole universe. Lord, your word among the gods arbitrates, destroys, and creates. Okay, so Marduk is king, and so we see the beginning of the kingdom of Marduk. Marduk is a Babylonian god. Okay, Tiamat is a Sumerian goddess. And so we see in this epic the blending together of first a Sumerian creation overlaid by a Babylonian epic in which Marduk is the hero. Marduk is a war god. He's a god who makes war. Here's a description of him. Then Marduk made a bow and strung it to be his own weapon. He set the arrow against the bowstring in his right hand. He grasped the mace and lifted it up. Bow and quiver hung at his side. Lightnings played in front of him. He was altogether an incandescent. Okay, now all the 7 winds were created, and then the tornado, and Marduk mounted the storm, his terrible chariot, and so then it goes on. It's very long, but you can see in this epic the sense of what the gods are like and how the universe was created. The world is a violent place, and the gods are forces of nature that are utterly uncaring of human beings. Okay. And here are some of these gods. This is another part of the epic, the flight of Etana to the skies. You can see these gods. The second epic that's very important is the epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, you had in your readings, in both of your readings today, the global experience, and in the other one, the human record. You have 2 different excerpts from Gilgamesh. Okay, how many of you have read Gilgamesh, the stories of Gilgamesh? Good. A couple of you have read them. All right. More than a couple. Several of you have read them. Okay, if you take, it's kind of good that we have 2 different books, because if you put the two readings together from the 2 different books, you have the entire story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. How does the story start out? How does the story start out? I know some of you have read it. What is Gilgamesh like in the beginning of the story? Okay, well, I'll tell you the story then. You can go through the whole thing. But Gilgamesh starts out as a lusty young man. Okay, which one is this? This one. This one where it begins. Oh, I'm sorry. I've gotten them mixed up. All right. It starts out in the global experience. It starts out. The story says, "I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. He's 2/3 God and 1/3 man. And he lives in the city of Uruk, and he is king of Uruk." It starts out, he is a young man, a teenager. He's probably 16 years old, and he's a lusty young man. He's king. He's king of the city, and he can do anything he wants. So what does he do? Well, he takes all the young boys for his army to go out and conquer them, taking them away from their families. And he takes all the virgins, no matter whether they're engaged to people or have girlfriends or boyfriends or not. And he takes first rights with all the young women. And so the city of Uruk really complain about him. He's utterly irresponsible, indulging all his whims, enjoying himself, because a king should be a shepherd to his people. His lust leaves no virgin to her lover, neither the warrior's daughter nor the wife of the noble. Yet this is the shepherd of the city, wise, comely, and resolute. He's not a good king. He's a very bad king. And so the people of the city of Uruk appeal to the gods, and they say, "Please do something about Gilgamesh. He's behaving very, very badly." And so the gods respond. Aruru, who is the goddess of creation, makes a companion for Gilgamesh, and this companion is Enkidu. Okay, I'm pronouncing it Enkidu because we have no idea how they pronounce these words, and so your guess is as good as mine how to pronounce it. I'm pronouncing it Enkidu. Okay, Aurora made Enkidu out of clay. She as an equal to him. So the goddess conceived an image in her mind, and it was of the stuff of Anu of the firmament. She dipped her hands in water and pinched off clay. She let it fall in the wilderness, and noble Enkidu was created. Okay, what is Enkidu like? Okay, He is innocent of all mankind. He is a noble savage. He is representative of an uncivilized man who has not been civilized. He lives with the animals. He talks to the animals. He doesn't know human beings at all. And he can commune with the animals. They are his friends, and he knows nothing at all of civilization. So he ate grass in the hills with the gazelle and lurked with the wild beasts at the water's holes. He had the joy of water with the herds of wild game. A trapper saw him. A trapper was scared of him. And so the trapper then went to Gilgamesh, and he said, "Here is this wild man in the wilderness. Can't you save us from him? I'm scared of him." And so Gilgamesh is very smart. And so he says, yes, what we'll do is we'll send a priestess. Okay, in this story it says a harlot, a child of pleasure. A harlot is a loaded word. She is not a harlot. She's not a prostitute. What she is a priestess who practices sex. And so these priestesses are servants to the sex god. I mean, there's a goddess of sex here. And so what this harlot does is she goes out in the woods and she finds Enkidu and she seduces him and she lays with him for 7 days and 7 nights and she teaches him the arts of civilization. So he is civilized by a woman, and this is very symbolic. You can tell it's very symbolic. For 6 days and 7 nights they lay together, for Enkidu had forgotten his home in the hills. But when he was satisfied, he went back to the wild beasts. But now the wild creatures rejected him. He was no longer a part of nature. He started out as part of nature. Now he's not part of nature anymore. "You are wise, Enkidu, and now you have become like a god," the priestess tells him. And she convinces him that he has to come and live in civilization now because he is not wild anymore. She divided her clothing in two, and with one half she clothed him. She taught him how to eat bread and drink wine, and when he got drunk, he was truly civilized when he drank lots of wine. He ate his fill and was full and drank strong wine. 7 goblets, he became merry, his heart exulted, and his face shone. Now he met Gilgamesh, and the two were twins. They were mirror images of each other. Both of them were very strong and very noble and very athletic, and as soon as they met, they competed with each other. This is very Mesopotamian, to compete with each other, very Sumerian, and so they had a wrestling match. They were wrestling with each other, and Gilgamesh threw Enkidu, and instead of killing him, though, they both recognized that they were equals. They were equally strong and equally athletic, and so they became very fast friends, best friends. So Enkidu and Gilgamesh embraced, and their friendship was sealed. They became very good friends. And then they went out, like young men do, adventuring together. They went to the cedars of Lebanon, where they met a fire-breathing ogre called Humbaba, and they killed him, and they got wood to bring back to the city, because there's no wood in the Sumerian valley. So they probably went to the areas of Lebanon, to the cedars of Lebanon, and got wood. When they returned to Uruk, Gilgamesh was offered marriage by the goddess of love, Ishtar, or Inanna. Okay, and so what Gilgamesh said to her was, "Well, your lovers don't last very long. You throw them over very quickly. So I don't really want to marry you." She wanted to marry him, and she was so angry that she sent the bull of heaven and against them, and they killed the bull of heaven. And then the other gods said, "Okay, they have killed the bull of heaven. One of them must die." Okay, these two young men. This is the beginning of Gilgamesh's education. Okay, Enkidu is the one who has to die. Gilgamesh is 2/3 God and 1/3 man. He's the king. He's not going to die. Enkidu is going to die. So Enkidu is dying, and he goes into a reflection of, why do I have to die, and was it worth it to become civilized? If I had been a part of nature like the animals, I never would have been conscious enough to know that I'm going to die. But now that I'm human, and I'm civilized, I'd know I'm going to die. And is it worth it to have this consciousness, he says. And he says, yes, it is. It was worth it to become conscious of my condition and of life and death. And so he dies. He imagines the afterlife as a life from which no one returns, where people sit in the dark all the time and eat dust. It's a terrible afterlife. It's the land from which no one returns. His death has a terrible impact on Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is racked with grief because he loved Enkidu as much as he loved himself. And he is terribly grieved, and he says, why do we have to die? Why do we have to die? And asking these terrible questions, he goes on a quest through the whole world to find out why we have to die. He wrestles with a lion, and he goes to the city of Siduri, a city by the seaside that is run by the goddess Siduri. And she says to him, Gilgamesh, why are you worrying about these things? Don't bother your head about them. Eat, drink, and be merry. Love the wife of your bosom. Hold the hand of your little child and enjoy life. It's all we've got. So we have this philosophy of this is the meaning of life, to eat, drink, and be merry and enjoy it. But Gilgamesh says, no, that's not the answer. I want eternal life. I want to know why we have to die. So then he goes to the ferryman who ferries the boat to the land of the dead. And this is Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim. I might have that down. Okay, here is the death of Enkidu. And here is Utnapishtim in the screen. He is the boatman, and he is immortal, but he started out as a human being. And Utnapishtim tells the story of the flood. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he became immortal. Once upon a time, long, long ago, the world was a boisterous place, and all the people were making lots of noise, and there was a lot of uproar all the time, and the gods got sick and tired of hearing those human beings making so much noise and causing so much trouble. So the gods said, well, let's just get rid of them. They're like a hill of ants. We'll just kill them all. We'll send a flood and kill them all. Okay, Utnapishtim has a dream, though, and he is forewarned by Ea, the god Ea, forewarns him that there's going to be a flood, and he says to Utnapishtim, build a ship, a great ship, and on it take 2 of all the kinds of the animals and your whole family, and when the flood comes, you will survive. Okay, so Utnapishtim builds the ship, and he survives the flood. And when the whole story is in here, you can read the story and all the details, but the gods let him live, and they give him immortality. And so his duty becomes ferrying the living to the land of the dead, the crossing over to the land of the dead. You recognize this story. It's the story of a great flood that destroys all mankind. Okay. This story was written long before the Bible was written, and the Hebrews took this story and changed it. Okay, but it's different. It's different from the story in the Bible. First of all, there are lots of gods, and second of all, they don't care a thing about human beings. They think of them as so many ants or bugs that they're going to squash when they get bothersome. And so this is the attitude of the gods toward the men. Okay, Utnapishtim takes Gilgamesh to the land of the dead, where people sit in the dark and eat dirt all day. It's real gloomy, and it's no fun. It's not paradise. It's a bad place to be. And nobody ever returns from the land of the dead. And so Gilgamesh then, Utnapishtim won't give him immortal life, but he says there's a plant that, and he tells him where it is in the sea. He has to dive for it. And if he gets this plant, he can take it, and it'll restore your youth. And then we have a big surprise in the story. Instead of taking the plant and gobbling it up, Gilgamesh says, oh, I'm going to take this plant home to my city, and I'm going to give it to the old men of the city. So he has changed. His character has changed. Okay, he's no longer selfish and self-centered, but he's gotten a consciousness of what it's like to be a king and the responsibility for the people of his land. Okay, so he takes the plant and he's going home with it to give it to the men of his city, but he stumbles and falls and drops it, and a snake runs out and grabs it and eats the plant up and instantly sheds his skin and becomes young again. But the plant is gone, and so now he mourns that he cannot save the men of his city and give them youth again. So he comes home to the city. He travels day and night. When he gets there, he looks at his city, and he rebuilds the walls to defend the city, and he builds temples to the gods, and he takes care of his people and becomes a good shepherd of the city. So this is the story of Gilgamesh. Okay, and let's go back to this, what question is the story asking? I told you about the story. What question is the story asking? Yeah.
Why do we have to die?
Why do we have to die? Okay, that's one of the questions that the story is asking. Why do we have to die? Does Gilgamesh change from the beginning to the end? Okay. What is the meaning of these changes in Gilgamesh? What is this story about? Yeah.
What is virtue, and how is morality going to play a part in the character's internal self?
Well, in a way, yes, but Gilgamesh, he starts out as a selfish young man, but he learns. He learns responsibility. He matures. It's a coming-of-age story. It's how he learns to become a mature man and to do his duty. And so one of the questions is, what is life all about? What is the meaning of life? Okay, why are we living? What should we do with our lives? Not only why do we have to die, but what should we do with our lives? And the answer he finds is that we have to do our duty. And his duty is to be king, and the duty of a king is to take care of his people. So he learns in the end of the story that he has to take care of his people. How does he cope with adversity? Yeah.
Well, I guess he matures in as far as coping with his adversity, because at first he was crying about Enkidu's death,
Yep.
and then towards I guess the end of what we read, he doesn't end up crying or whining that the snake ate the plant, but he ends up going back to his city and saying, well, this happened. But what we can do is we can build some forts to help fortify the city, to build some walls to help protect our city and protect our elders.
Yeah. So he learns and he matures, and he becomes a mature, rational person. He's no longer this young and lusty, adventurous man. And so it's a coming-of-age story. So he becomes a model for his subject, and this shows what the Sumerians expect from a king. They expect protection from a king. They expect the kind of care from a king that a shepherd would give them. And so Gilgamesh learns to be king largely through experience, through the experience that he has in his life. Okay. So here is the story then. We go through it. T. Jeffrey Bibby and Peter Wilhelm Glob at Aarhus University in Denmark in the 1950s actually discovered Gilgamesh's island on Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf. And this was Gilgamesh's island where he went in search of Utnapishtim, the secret island where he searched for eternal life. And this is Dilmun off of Saudi Arabia. Here are the cedars of Lebanon. Remember, they went to the cedars of Lebanon to get wood for the city. So this is the first great epic story of the first piece of literature in the world, in fact. Okay. What about women and the gods? Well, a lot of these goddesses are very powerful. What about Ishtar, the goddess of love? She's very powerful. They're equal to the men. Inanna is another goddess, is another name for Ishtar. In fact, there's a story of Inanna, or Ishtar's journey to the underworld. She goes to the underworld, and on the way, she takes off all her clothing so that step by step, she ends up entering the world of the dead utterly naked, which is how all people enter death. And she wants to know how she can escape from the underworld. How can she go back to the land of the living? And the answer that the god of death gives her is that she can escape from the underworld and come back in the spring if she will ritually murder her consort, her husband, who is also her son. And so every year in a great festival, there is a ritual murder of the consort of the queen. And so this is there's ritual sex and ritual harlot priestesses, the ritual sacrifice of the son consort. So this is a society in which women have a powerful part to play. Marija Gimbutas, an anthropologist, was very interested in this and talked about the origins of patriarchy. Her studies were continued by Gerda Lerner, who wrote a book of this name, The Origins of Patriarchy, where she hypothesized that the subjugation of women began in Mesopotamia, that it was the beginning of civilization that caused the subjugation of women. Mallory, who wrote a book called In Search of the Indo-Europeans, proves that the people that Marija Gimbutas was studying, who were women-dominated, were actually the Indo-Europeans, which is kind of interesting. Okay, the home of the gods is in the mountains, and that's where the weather comes from. So if you want to reach the gods, you need to go to the mountains, right? But what if you can't go to the mountains? It's inconvenient, it's not easy enough to go to the mountains, so you build one. You build an artificial mountain. Every one of these cities in the Sumerian cities has an artificial mountain in the middle, and that artificial mountain is a ziggurat, and that is the characteristic building of Sumerian cities. And all of the Mesopotamian cities, here is a ziggurat. It's a temple to the gods that dominates the whole city. And this is a ziggurat. Again, Sherry Sheffield sent me this photograph of the ruins of a ziggurat that is still there. The ziggurat is controlled by the priests, and it is the storehouse of the god. It is the god's home in the city. The city itself is the possession of the god, and each city was owned by a god. For example, Babylon belongs to Marduk. The people are the slaves of the god, and the ziggurat is the storehouse of the god. All the lands of the city were owned by the god, and the priests distributed tools and food to all the people and land to all the people. So who do you think are the most powerful people in these city-states? The priests. The priests are the powerful city. Trade and commerce developed between the city-states. Okay. The people are the slaves of the god, and they exist to serve the god. Here are some of these cities: Sumer, Uruk, and Babylon. The biblical Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. It was a tower built to reach the gods, and the Bible tells us that. The land is owned by the god, and the priests distribute tools and food. Here is a restoration of the Tower of Babel. Okay, there's competition between the cities, and there's trade and commerce between the cities, and we see the beginning of a free enterprise society. One of the particular hallmarks is trade and textiles, especially, and pottery. Writing seems to begin with cylinder seals. And cylinder seals are like a spool of thread, a small spool, and you take it and you roll it in clay. You carve a picture on it, and then you roll it in clay, and that is the signature of the merchant. And that's how writing began. Okay, the writing that was developed in Mesopotamia was cuneiform writing, and here again are the city-states, all in competition with each other. Here is the kind of pottery that would have been traded. a silver vase. And here's a cylinder seal. It's like a spool of thread that you would roll in clay. Okay. Here is cuneiform writing. It is impressions made by a stick in clay. Okay. It's a wedge-shaped clay tool, and you put it in different positions on the clay in order to make symbols that have meanings of words. This is a clay tablet, and here are the wedge-shaped symbols of cuneiform writing in a Babylonian brick, and here is early Babylonian signs showing pictorial origin. Trade documents survive in abundance. Most everything that still survives are trade documents. This is mostly what they wrote about. They traded without money. They had no money. They used bits of metal and they weighed them. So they chopped up metal and they weighed portions of it, and that was the money that they used. It was a free enterprise society. They had a government. At first, decisions were made by consensus. Temporary leaders arose and faded back. There's a transition from the name of the leader from a lugau to the NC, and this symbolizes the evolution of kings, and where an individual does not fade back into the group, but remains a leader. And so we see the beginning of kings and power, and the beginnings of law codes. Okay, the most famous code, and you have some readings from this code, is Hammurabi's code, but shorter codes preceded Hammurabi's. His dates to 1750 BC. And here we have a Sumerian city king leading a phalanx of his troops. And here you see Hammurabi's code, and let's take a minute to look at this. This is the prologue. It's not in any of your readings, but it is on our website. Okay. When lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, the determiner of the destinies of the land, determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, dominion over all mankind, then did Anu and Enlil name me, Hammurabi, the devout, God-fearing prince, to make justice rule in the land, to destroy the wicked and unjust, that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like Shamush over the Mesopotamian people, and to light up the land, to promote the well-being of the people. Here we have an echo of Gilgamesh. Okay, it's the job of Hammurabi, who is like Shamash, ruling over the people like the sun over all the people. Now remember that Hammurabi was a great conqueror who conquered all of the Mesopotamian river valley, and so he's portraying himself as the sun shining over all people to bring justice to the land. Marduk gave him dominion over all mankind, meaning everybody in the Mesopotamian river valley. So a prelude was a kind of democracy, but Shamash is a god of justice, and Hammurabi himself sees himself as a representative of Shamash. The king is to rule as the god would, and Hammurabi writes his code saying that the judges are to rule as he, the king, would. Okay, here is the epilogue, and here we get a little more of this information. I made an end of war. I promoted the welfare of the land. I made the peoples rest in friendly dwellings. I did not allow troublemakers in their midst. The great gods called me, and I was the beneficent shepherd of a righteous scepter, and my benign shadow spread over my city. And I took to my bosom the peoples of Sumer and Akkad, by conquering them, of course. That's how he took them to his bosom. And they prospered under my protection. I have governed them in peace. I have sheltered them with my wisdom, that the strong might not oppress the weak, that justice might be done to the orphan and the widow. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come into the presence of my statue as King of Justice. Read my inscribed stela, and give ear to my precious words, and may my stela make clear to him his cause, show him his rights, and set his mind at rest. Okay, he has this law code guaranteeing justice to all the people. And here it is, Hammurabi on his stela, And you have two readings from Hammurabi's code. They're virtually the same in both of your books. But here is his law code on this stela, which was set up in the center of every city with Hammurabi at the top of it, and anybody could come and read the laws. The laws were published for everybody to know what they were. This implies that everybody could read my stela. Could the subjects read? This is a letter from Hammurabi. It appears that they could. Here is the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, which was Hammurabi's city. And here is an ancient Babylonian schoolhouse in the days of Hammurabi. One of your readings, which is very delightful, is a Sumerian schoolboy text in the Global Experience. And the little schoolboy tells about how he goes to school, and his mother fixes his lunch, and he goes to school. And his teachers beat him for everything he does wrong. He doesn't do his lessons right, and he doesn't interpret everything right, and he doesn't write correctly, and he doesn't recite correctly, and they beat him for everything. So he goes to his father and he says, "Look, Father, bring the teacher to our house and give him lots of money and make friends with him and let him teach me at home." And so he ends up being taught to be a scribe, and he's very successful with the tutoring that he gets, and he grows up to be an important man. Well, here's the school, and so the implication is that people in Babylon could all read and write. Okay. Hammurabi's Code itself, I hope a lot of you have read this. You know, there weren't very many reading assignments this week. They're going to get heavier as we go along. You really should keep up with the reading assignments for the class. We see laws for trade protection and quality control. Women have a lot of rights. If you read the code to see the rights of women, they have rights to their husband's property. They have rights to their children's property. They can be wine merchants. Only women are wine merchants and tavern mistresses. There are rights of farmers and merchants. For example, if a merchant is on the road and a robber steals from him, the judges of the city have to reimburse him because they did not keep the road free of brigands. Okay, so that they're reimbursed by the city. But there is an eye for an eye. An example is if a builder builds a house that collapses and kills a man, then he's killed. If a doctor operates on someone and the patient dies, then the doctor is killed, or his hand is chopped off. A robber has his hand chopped off. There are fines for the lower classes. One of the first things you see in the Code of Hammurabi is that there is slavery. Slaves are punished and slaves are protected. There's trial by ordeal for magic spells. There's penalty for false witness or perjury. They're not supposed to lie in court. Judges must be ethical. Judges can be punished for giving false judgment that is not true. There is private property. People can own private property. There are humane laws for women, and they have a right to the family property if their husband dies, and they have a right to take care of their children who are under them. And as I mentioned before, the state's responsibility for criminal losses. And so read these codes carefully, and you will be able to discern from them exactly what the culture was like in Mesopotamia. These are one of the best sources to see what the culture was like, looking at these law codes. There was political and commercial development. Geographical expansion was upstream, but there was always constant warfare between the cities. Constant warfare between the cities, which we are still seeing to this day, I might remind you. There was political and commercial development and the warfare between the cities. The first unifier of the entire Tigris-Euphrates Valley was Sargon of Akkad, and he was from one of the northern city-states. He was Semitic, and he then unified the entire Mesopotamian river valley. Naraman succeeded him, and this happens very early in 2200 BC. The people are very pessimistic. One example of this, you're not reading it, but it's the lament for The Lament for Ur is a kind of prayer, a poem that describes life in the Mesopotamian river valley. The storms come, the people mourn. The floods destroy the city, the people mourn. The attackers come and conquer the city, the people mourn. The refrain for everything that happens is the people mourn, and it cites disaster after disaster after disaster. And this is the pattern of life in Mesopotamia, in the city-states. We have a pattern of conquest. The whole river valley is repeatedly conquered over and over again by strong rulers who then take over it, and then it's conquered again. In 2331 BC, we have the first conqueror, Sargon of Akkad. Then, in 1792 to 1750 BC, Hammurabi from Babylon conquers the entire river valley. In the 700s BC, the Assyrians come. These are the Neo-Assyrians. There are actually two groups of Assyrians that conquer in different waves. The Assyrians, we'll talk about them more when we look at the barbarian invasions, but they're called the Nazis of the Middle East. They're ferocious invaders and conquerors. In 812 to 322 BC, the Persians progressively conquer the entire Mesopotamian river valley. Finally, in 322 BC, the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, finally conquer the Mesopotamian river valley and Persia and everything else. Okay, we might pause for a moment to talk about the dating system, BC and AD. BC is everything before the birth of Christ, and the line between BC and AD is the year 1, okay, in which Christ was born. AD is Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and this is the dating system that has been used since the early Middle Ages, and it's the dating system we use right now. From the line in the middle, which is the year 1, we count backward in the years BC, so that if you notice with our dates, 2331 BC is 2,000 years before Christ. That's the first conqueror, Sargon of Akkad. The next conqueror is 1792 to 1750. That is closer to the birth of Christ, because we're counting backwards from BC. Okay, have you all got that dating system? All right. Okay, so that's the dating system we'll use. Okay, and here are the city-states of the Sumerian cities that are constantly and repeatedly conquered over and over again. Here we see the conquests of Babylon and of Assyria. The yellow is Babylon, the pink is Assyria, and both of them conquer the whole river valley, and here we can see the extension of both of those city-states. Here are Semitic bowmen. These are Akkadians of early Babylonia fighting in open order, warriors fighting. It's a warlike society. They're constantly at war with each other, either between the city-states themselves or conquerors unifying the whole area. And here is a Semitic prince and his Sumerian secretary. Okay, this is the 27th century BC, and so we see the prince with his Sumerian servants. The conquerors, every single conqueror, and let's go back to our conquerors again, whether they're Sargon of Akkad or Hammurabi or the Assyrians or the Persians, they absorb the Sumerian culture, and the Sumerian culture is the core culture. It is the culture that everyone adopts. It is the culture that everyone, even if they speak different languages, like the Assyrians and the Akkadians spoke a different language from Sumerian, but they adopt the culture, they adopt the gods, they adopt the customs. So the culture of Sumeria is the culture that shapes the entire civilization of Mesopotamia. Okay, we have a minute for questions, comments. Okay, we've looked at the first civilization in the Middle East. We'll take about a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll look at the second civilization in the Middle East, and this is the civilization of Egypt. So we'll move a little bit to the south, and we'll look at Egypt when we come back.